You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 344, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The last few weeks, we've talked about some of the economic crises that states faced in the years following the end of the war. The big hope to end many of these financial problems was wrapped up in selling Western lands to raise money. This made opening up the lands that came to be known as the Northwest Territory a critical event. This week, we're going to take a look at the final major legal step needed to make that happen, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, that land today makes up the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. For people at the time, this was the land that was northwest of the Ohio River, reaching as far west as the Mississippi River, and as far north as the border with British Canada. The Continental Congress's first two legislative efforts to establish a legal framework for this territory came in the form of the land ordinances of 1784 and 1785, which we discussed in episodes 334 and 336. The first step in this process was for Congress to get the various states to give up their personal claims to the land. France, Spain, and Britain had already ceded their claims to the land in the peace treaty that ended the war in 1783. But the treaty didn't specify anything more than that those foreign powers weren't going to assert any claims on the land. It really didn't settle who was the undisputed owner of such lands within the U.S. Different states had conflicting claims to Western lands based on various colonial charters. Britain had granted contradictory charters during the colonial era for a variety of reasons. Beyond those disputes between the states as to who really owned these territories, even if there was only one state that could claim the land, Congress wanted to take that to form new states. Congress put pressure on the states to give up land claims on these Western lands. It did so by coming up with plans to assess taxes on states based on the land they owned. So by giving up the claims to these lands, which really didn't generate any revenue for the state could avoid owing more taxes to Congress. The first session came back in 1783, when Virginia formally ceded its claims to this area. Virginia had agreed to do that in order to get Maryland to agree to the Articles of Confederation in 1781. Virginia's cession was conditional in that it called for the territory to be formed into new states that would join the Union. Virginia did not want to give up its claims just so some other eastern state could assert its claims on the land. This put further pressure on the other states to give up their claims. New York had a more questionable claim to some of the land, which it gave up early as well. Several New England states also had claims based on their colonial charters. Massachusetts and Connecticut had claims that stretched all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. The original point of granting these broad charters was to encourage the colonies to challenge land claims by other European powers in those inland areas. At the time Britain wrote these charters, there was no Pennsylvania colony, and New York was under the control of the Dutch, and further to the west, France and Spain had made land claims. New England states had not made any effort to act on these claims to these far inland areas during the colonial era. Connecticut had tried to claim some lands that eventually became part of New York and Pennsylvania, but never moved further west during the colonial era. Similarly, Massachusetts agreed to a western border with New York early in the colonial era, and Pennsylvania's western border was set by its colonial charter. Massachusetts ceded its claims to these western lands in 1785 without much fuss. Connecticut was more reticent. The state had only recently given up its claims to what is today northern Pennsylvania. Connecticut colonists and Pennsylvania colonists has actually fought over these claims before and during the Revolutionary War, and I mean literally went to war and shot at each other over these land claims. The most recent flare-up of the so-called Pennamite-Yankee Wars took place in July 1784, after the Revolutionary War had ended, when a group of Connecticut Yankees burned a Pennsylvania fort and attempted to occupy land around what is today Wilkes-Barre. Pennsylvania militia soon captured and arrested the trespassers, but the conflict would continue to simmer for many more years. Connecticut also still hoped to claim land west of Pennsylvania. That was this area that was in dispute for the Northwest Territories. Finally, in 1786, Connecticut gave up most of the claims, but they still claimed what they called the, quote, Western Reserve, an area of land that makes up most of what is today northern Ohio, along the southern bank of Lake Erie. In total, the reserve made up nearly 3.3 million acres, which is nearly the size of Connecticut itself. There was also the issue of the Indians who actually lived on this land. Many of these tribes had been pushed into this land after being forced out of Pennsylvania and Virginia, but given the relative power of the United States, the tribes were not really in any position to put up an effective resistance. As we discussed back in episode 336, representatives of these tribes had ceded much of the land in the treaties of Fort Stanwix, Fort McIntosh, and Fort Finney. While many Indians did not recognize the legality of those treaties, it settled the matter legally as far as Congress was concerned. Even so, those treaties reserved large swaths of land for the Indians to remain in what is today central Ohio, as well as lands further to the west. Finally, there was the issue of settlers who had already taken some of this land. Virginia had carved out a district in what is today southern Ohio to make good on its promises of land to Revolutionary War veterans. Thousands of acres had already been settled under the guidance of George Rogers Clark. There were also several settlements along the Mississippi River that Virginia had taken during the war. French settlers moving south from Quebec had established most of these villages and had land claims to them. While this posed no threat to Congress's sovereign control of the land, it did try to respect private property ownership claims that were already in some of the parts of this territory. Those areas, however, were relatively small and could be handled. The bigger issue for Congress was squatters. These were private citizens who simply moved into the land and claimed it as their own without paying for it or registering it or anything. In some cases, they made private deals with neighboring Indians to acquire their claims. In other cases, they just moved into an empty area and began developing the land. This was rough country with rough people settling the land. Without any government, squatters could use brute force to retain possession of their land claims. If Congress settled the land too slowly, squatters would simply move in ahead of them and take the land for themselves. Yet, Congress could not move too quickly. The vast area of land available would have to be populated over many years. It would take several years just to survey the area. Even after it was surveyed, you couldn't just sell all that land all at once. That would simply create a land glut that no one would be able to purchase. The result would be unsettled land simply going into private hands. Now, under the 1785 land ordinance, tracts of land were supposed to be sold in parcels of 640 acres. The plan was to sell the land at auction, but with a minimum $1 per acre price. Of course, most private citizens could not come up with that kind of money, $640 for a parcel of land. Congress wanted all sales in specie, that is gold or silver. It was not going to accept paper dollars at face value. It required payment in full at the time of sale. This made it nearly impossible for most regular people who wanted to start their own farms to be able to make this purchase. Also, all of the land had to be surveyed before the land sales could begin, and the time for the surveys meant that the land auctions did not even begin until 1787. Now, there were groups of speculators who formed to take advantage of buying in bulk and then selling to individual families at a profit. As early as 1785, Nathaniel Sackett offered to take all the land which currently makes up most of the state of Ohio off Congress's hands for, well, nothing. Sackett's plan was to serve as an administrator of the land, making sure the land would go to families who would actually settle it. They would, of course, have to buy it from him, and that land then could not be resold for several years. Now, some of you may recall the name Nathaniel Sackett. He was the Continental Army's head of intelligence under General Washington during an early part of the war. Benjamin Talmadge later took over his role. And Sackett, like Talmadge, was a character on the TV show Turn. After leaving intelligence, Sackett made a fortune as a sutler for the Army, and he hoped to spend his post-war years creating and settling this new western state. Sackett's request for an entire state to be handed over to him for free might seem a bit outrageous, but you have to remember that in the colonial era, governors often gave very large tracts of land to men who they thought would be capable of settling the territory thus preventing foreign claims to the land from taking hold and keeping the settlements organized. That said, in this situation, Congress needed money and was not prepared to give away the state of Ohio. A more serious effort to make a bulk purchase of land came from the newly formed Ohio Company of Associates. You may remember some discussions in really early episodes of this podcast of an Ohio company that formed in the 1760s when Virginia was pushing British officials to open up this same territory. That Ohio company folded when the Revolutionary War began. This new Ohio company is a completely different one. This new organization was founded by a group of investors, all veteran Continental officers from New England. Major General Samuel Holden Parsons had several key commands in New York and Connecticut during the war. General Rufus Putnam, who helped build West Point and other important engineering projects, he actually only became a brigadier general at the very end of the war. Benjamin Tupper served throughout the war with notable service at Saratoga and Monmouth. He received a brevet to brigadier general at the end of the war. And the fourth founder was Manasseh Cutler, a New England minister who had served as a chaplain for several years during the war. These four former officers who had served together during the war met at Bunch of Greats Tavern in Boston in March of 1786. They decided that if they could create a company that could front a large amount of money and offer some services in helping individuals settle the territory, they could make a fortune. And during its first year, the Ohio Company sold shares to 250 investors. Meanwhile, Cutler traveled to New York on behalf of the company to lobby Congress to purchase a large portion of the new territory. Initially, the company hoped to purchase 600,000 acres along the Ohio River. Congress rejected this offer. Cutler, however, was undeterred. He began working with William Dewar, who briefly served as a Continental colonel and had also served in both Congress and the New York State Legislature during the war. He sat on several congressional boards involving government finances and had also amassed a small fortune through government contracts and the purchase of Loyalist properties during the war. Dewar was serving as secretary for the Congressional Board of Treasury when Cutler arrived in New York in the summer of 1786. Dewar advised Cutler that Congress might find the deal more attractive if there was a larger offer for more land. Dewar formed his own land company called the Scioto Group. This would take a much larger land claim further to the north and west of the land sought by the Ohio Company. This land would go as far west as the Scioto River, which is today in central Ohio. Dewar promised to raise a much larger investment group, taking advantage of major investors from across America and Europe. The two companies worked together to create an acceptable offer to Congress. Many investors put money in both companies, so they tended to work together in getting Congress to go along with the deal. Essentially, the offer to Congress was an agreement for the Ohio Company to purchase 1.5 million acres with an option to buy an additional 3.5 million acres. The Ohio Company turned over that option for the 3.5 million acres to the Scioto Group. The buyers also insisted that the government assume the cost of governing these newly settled lands, offering military protection from Indians, as well as courts and law enforcement. The main problem with this offer was that Congress had no legal authority to accept it. The Land Ordinance of 1785 required that all land would be sold at auction, meaning one group could not just buy a really large chunk without giving anyone else a chance to buy that same land. The law also required minimum purchases of $1 per acre. The offer from the Ohio Company came to about 67 cents an acre. They wanted to buy 1.5 million acres for $1 million. On top of that, the company was only offering paper money. Continental dollars and certificates from veterans were currently trading at about 12 cents on the dollar, so really the company was offering the equivalent of about $120,000 in specie for the 1.5 million acres, or about 8 cents an acre. The company also was not willing to pay all of this up front, as was required under the law. They would pay half up front and half when the surveys were completed. And the larger option for the 3.5 million more acres would not require a purchase for several more years, after which time that land was going to have become much more valuable. This all meant that government insiders were getting a massive sweetheart deal on land that would enrich themselves as they sold off the land at retail. Since the offer did not comply with the current law, Congress had to vote on whether to create a new law that would allow this deal to go forward. Over a period of more than a year, in late 1786 and early 1787, Congress debated the terms of the new ordinance for the territories. One of the biggest changes was that Congress would initially assume governance of the new territories directly. Earlier laws had been written with the assumption that those who moved into the territories would govern themselves. But these insider investors did not like the idea that they might have to go before locally elected judges and juries to assert their legal claims. Juries made up of locals would likely support the interests of locals. To address this concern, the new ordinance established that the territory would be governed in 3 separate stages. In the first stage, a secretary and 3 judges, which would all be appointed by Congress, would just govern the territory. The second stage would kick in once the population exceeded 5,000 adult males. At that point, locals could vote for a lower house, but Congress would still appoint the governor and the rest of the executive and the judicial branches, as well as an upper house in the legislature. Once the population reached 60,000, the people's representatives could write a state constitution and petition Congress for statehood. Only when Congress agreed to the Constitution would statehood be granted, and the local population would have full rights on the same footing as the original 13 states as part of this confederation. The ordinance also guaranteed certain basic rights for all inhabitants. This included freedom of religion, habeas corpus, trial by jury, due process of law, a prohibition on cruel and unusual punishments, protection of private contracts, and free use of the waterways. There was an assurance that government could not take private property without compensation, other than normal taxes, which were similar to those paid by people in the original states. The law also provided for a free public education, banned slavery and involuntary servitude, and guaranteed that the new states would have a republican form of government. The new law retained the grid system that had been set up in 1785, where each township would be divided into 36 grids of 640 acres each. However, it did not attempt to set up territorial or state borders within the territory. Instead, it simply decreed that the whole territory eventually would be divided into at least 3, but no more than 5 states. Until it was large enough to be subdivided, it would be governed as a single territory. After considerable debate, Congress finally passed the Northwest Ordinance on July 13, 1787. Only one member of Congress voted against it. Abraham Yates was concerned that the movement into this territory would set off a series of wars with the Indians. Congress further authorized the Board of Treasury to negotiate with the Ohio Company to come up with acceptable terms. This eventually led to the sale of the 1.5 million acres for $1 million in depreciated currency, with only half paid up front, along with that 3.5 million acre option, just as the company wanted. Even with the deal in place, Congress did not receive the Ohio Company's first payment until October 1787. The Ohio Company began selling preferred lots of lands, at first to insiders, for $10 an acre. Settlement of the land would begin in 1788, when Rufus Putnam led a group of 48 New England settlers to establish what would become Marietta, Ohio. This settlement on the north bank of the Ohio River was directly across from a military outpost built on the southern bank. This provided the first settlers with some level of protection from Indians in the event that they might not be happy about settlers finally crossing the Ohio River. Arthur Sinclair, who had been president of Congress when the ordinance passed, received appointment as the first governor of the Northwest Territory in October of 1787. He made his way to Marietta to assume governance over the new territory. The initial settlers arrived in April 1788. Sinclair arrived in July. The following month, the town of Cincinnati was established, and that was where Sinclair made his home. Next week, the nation's leaders begin the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. As always, I want to thank my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Richard McCabe, and 10 Crucial Days. You can get a lot of great information on the issues around Washington's Crossing and the battles of Trenton and Princeton at 10crucialdays.org. I also want to welcome Tyler Tipton, who joined as a standard bearer this month. Remember that everyone who joins me on Patreon at the $10 level or higher gets a magnet each month with a different flag from the American Revolution. If you don't want to make a continuing donation to the podcast, I do appreciate one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. Before we get into this week's discussion, I wanted to mention that I've already begun adding short bonus episodes midweek to talk about what's happening 250 years ago this week. Since we're beginning the 250th anniversary of the war this spring, I thought it would be a fun way to follow events through their 250th anniversaries. If you like this feature, or if you don't like it, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Now, this week, of course, we covered the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The insider deals that helped to establish the first settlements in the Northwest Territory really did relatively little to help Congress pay down its debts. Sadly, this would not be the last time that savvy people with lots of money were able to make great deals with Congress for public properties. It's important to remember that the same time that Congress was passing the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 in New York, the Constitutional Convention was already underway in Philadelphia. It was not until the Constitution was established that Congress really began tackling the debt problem. Now, there were also interesting legal questions about the Northwest Ordinance after the Continental Congress ended in 1789 and was replaced by the United States Congress under the Constitution. To resolve those issues, the U.S. Congress passed a new law in 1789 that essentially reiterated the Northwest Ordinance with a few very minor changes. While I'm on the subject, I've heard some complaints that I still sometimes call the Confederation Congress the Continental Congress. I tend to use both of those terms interchangeably. Some will argue that the Second Continental Congress ended in 1781 when they adopted the Articles of Confederation, and that we should call them the Confederation Congress after that time. The problem with that is that contemporaries during this period still referred to these folks as the Continental Congress. Members of Congress themselves referred to the Continental Congress. In light of that, I'm comfortable using the term myself until the Congress finally dissolves in 1789. One of the things I barely mentioned in the main show was the fact that slavery was outlawed in the Northwest Territory. This really wasn't a big deal at the time. The southern slave states happily approved the ordinance with this in place. Most people, including Southerners at this time, seemed to believe that slavery was not really a good thing and should be phased out over time. Now, of course, Southern slave owners were in no hurry about this, but they had not yet reached the point where Southern leaders argued that slavery was a, quote, positive good. That was something that was going to happen later in the 19th century. When Abraham Lincoln first burst onto the national stage in the late 1850s, it was based on his address at the Cooper Union in New York. His speech was essentially the result of his research on the votes of the Founding Fathers, including their votes for the Northwest Ordinance. Lincoln set forth the argument not only that the federal government had the power to ban slavery in the territories, but that most of the founders wanted that to happen. So the anti-slavery provision of this ordinance became a much bigger deal in later decades. Now, the Ohio Company never paid the money it owed for the land grant after its initial payment of that 50% of the purchase price using paper money. Its leaders hoped to continue buying paper money at a discount and use that to make the final payments. However, it could never buy enough to complete the deal. When Congress agreed to buy all paper at face value, that discount market dried up completely. The company eventually got Congress to give it title to half of the land, that is, the 750 acres, for the half payment that it had already made. Even then, the company got some of the most desirable land available at a discount price that had been paid for buying the larger portion. Congress also gave the company another more than 200,000 acres to distribute to veterans holding bounty rights, an additional 100,000 acres to be given to settlers. This later became known as the donation land. So the really good deal that the Ohio Company had bargained got even better over time for them. In the end, the company divided up lots that were never sold among its shareholders and effectively went out of business in 1796. Well, technically, the company remained, but it had no more land to give by that time. The Scioto Group was even worse. It never paid for any of its land options, yet it sold thousands of acres to buyers in Europe. Now, this came to a head in the 1790s when a bunch of refugees from the French Revolution came to settle on land that they had purchased. This led to litigation, where it was decided that since the Scioto Group had never paid for the option to buy the land it had sold, the sale was not valid. As a result, the buyers were out of luck and had to buy the land all over again. William Dewar, who headed that Scioto Group, went on to become Assistant Secretary of Treasury under Alexander Hamilton. He continued to speculate wildly, finally losing all of his money in the financial panic of 1792 and spending the last 7 years of his life in debtor's prison. It also turned out that the lone dissenter to the Northwest Ordinance, Yates, was absolutely right about his concerns over war with the Indians. As governor of the territories, Arthur Sinclair would lead an army into the largest defeat against Indians in American history at Wabash in 1791. Sinclair would continue in office until 1802, when President Jefferson removed him. Ohio Company founder Samuel Holden Parsons became the territory's Chief Justice. And I think, as I mentioned in another episode, he froze to death in 1789 while doing a survey of Connecticut's Western Reserve in what is today northern Ohio. Rufus Putnam had led a first group of pioneers to found the town of Marietta, Ohio. Putnam later became a territorial judge after Parsons' death. He would also serve under General Anthony Wayne in the army to put down the Indian resistance following the victory over Sinclair. Putnam will go on to serve as U.S. Surveyor General and a delegate to the Ohio Constitutional Convention in 1802. He would also be a trustee to Ohio University. Manasseh Cutler, the lobbyist who secured this deal, went on to get elected to the U.S. Congress and help found the University of Ohio. Anybody who's gone there may be familiar with Cutler Hall, which is named in his honor. Cutler, though, never moved into the territory. There are several good books on the Northwest Ordinance. My recommendation this week is The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, a Bicentennial Handbook by Robert Taylor. As the title might suggest, this was written for the bicentennial of the ordinance, which happened in 1987, and gives a great overview of related events. I particularly like the chronology at the beginning of the book. It's relatively short at under 200 pages, and actually under 100 pages if you don't count the appendix, notes, and index. There is also a borrow-only copy on archive.org. The author was a professor at Indiana University, although he died in 1999. So if you want a good summary of the events surrounding the ordinance, get a copy of The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, a Bicentennial Handbook. My online recommendation is for those who really want to dig deep. Now, this is an older book called The Life, Journals, and Correspondence of Reverend Manasseh Cutler, LLD, Volume 1. Cutler was, as we talked about in the main episode, the deal maker behind the Ohio Company, and this book has all the correspondence and primary information that Cutler wrote during this period. This book was published in 1888 and is therefore in the public domain. As always, I've included direct links to it on my blog and website. And my question this week asks, after capturing John Andre, the Continentals wanted to exchange him for Benedict Arnold, but Clinton did not want to give up Arnold, so couldn't the Continentals ask for something else just as substantial? Let's say exchanging Andre for 500 Continental prisoners. Well, the short answer is no. For starters, Washington wanted justice to come swiftly. He was in no mood for extended negotiations on prisoner exchanges. More generally, Washington objected to prisoner exchanges because it was actually easier for him to recruit more soldiers than it was for the British to get replacement soldiers for their prisoners. The two sides had tried to come up with a convention that would allow for the exchange of officers or enlisted men of different ranks, but they really couldn't agree to any. Exchanging Major Andre for anyone other than Arnold would have been seen as treating him as a legitimate prisoner of war. He was a spy. Treating him any other way would have been seen by the British as a lack of resolve on the part of the Americans. There needed to be punishment for Arnold's treason, and absent Arnold, Andre was the one who was going to have to pay the price. Arnold was tried and convicted 6 days after his capture, and he was hanged just 3 days later. If you have a question you would like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.